Cheers, Lee. Yeah, so just to reinforce that point, it's the just trying to think a little bit about what sits beneath the surface, really, of what we often just see as a from superficial. I guess the world we sometimes find ourselves in is fast paced, and we've got to get on and do some stuff, and we feel like we have to get in there. Just that pause for a moment to look just beneath the surface of some of the things that are happening, particularly for the individuals, for the people that we're working with, working alongside, from their perspective and about their experience really. So just in terms of some of the a few recommended reads and what relates to some of the content from today, just putting this out there. Obviously, the slides will be made available, so you can have a look at these. But these are three books that really reflect a lot of the content from today. So when Lee asked me to do this, I was thinking about what's the frame, what's the context that I'm talking about here. And I think those of you who saw the Channel 4 documentary on, it's my local organisation. I used to work there, so I had a look at it from a different perspective. But also, I just wanted to think about what's going on there. We can look at the superficial, we can all jump to conclusions, and we can all make an assumption. But I'm trying to know what's going on there. And then I thought, well, what's really going on there? And then I thought, what's really, really going on in ED in Shrewsbury and all across the country? And ultimately, all of it comes down to a degree of decision making and how people are in a situation, and what their decisions are in any given time, and how the environment and their own circumstances influence those decisions. And we know, and we talk about this a lot, people don't come to work to do a bad job. Nobody in Shrewsbury or anybody else comes to work in the morning thinking, "Yeah, I'm going to do a really bad job today." It's the environment that we put the people work in, and it's that the second phrase point here: safety in complex systems is created by people through practice at all levels of the organisation. When we talk about practice, what we're talking about there is behaviour change, behaviours, how people operate, how people think, what their behaviours are, and we know that what we often find is that we've heard this before, and I've heard this talked about before, about this improvement is in healthcare is 20% technical and 80% human. But more and more we find ourselves in an environment where that is probably flipped, and there's an over reliance, not necessarily from us, but from others, in terms of an over reliance on structure, on action plans, on PIDs even. It all becomes about a very functional, technical aspect. But we know, it's people that affect change. It's not a project plan or a well-written driver diagram. Those are all precursors. It's actually human beings that influence change. And a few points here sort of drawn out from the improvement leaders guides that, and I thought were really pertinent, that people are not machines. You cannot make others do what do as they're told, nor can you be everywhere all at watching everything everybody does. This point that we have to repeat ourselves so often, that it's command and control cannot work in a human intensive system like health and social care, bluntly because there's just not enough commanders and controllers to go round. But none of us would want to work in that kind of system, in this kind of knowledge economy that we exist in. I'm going to try and break this down and I've used this slide. Some of you may have seen this before, but I use this quite a lot in terms of describing how we see these different levels of application of improvement approach. You've got a very anatomical approach to improvement, which is the project management, the training, the governance, the action plans, that structural element to improvement, which is worthy and needed. But then how do we go a little bit below the surface of that into the physiological and psychological aspects about how we understand the people, the culture, the interpersonal relationships, importantly, the decision making, the traits, the attitudes. What's some of that past experience of the people that we're working in? What's the psychological well-being of the people that we're working with? And it's getting to that level. It may not always be comfortable or palatable because this may take a bit of time. It's not a quick fix, but isn't it honest to look a little bit deeper in terms of what is happening for the individuals, for the people that we're working with? Because we can build the best delivery plan and we can write the most well-written concordat, but when it comes to the doing bit, to a degree, we're leaving some of it to chance because we're not always understanding what's happening with the environment and the people that we are working with. And Kurt discovered this back in the 40s. So a lot of his research and a lot of the research since And he identified that, in his words, the understanding and learning which the process produces for individuals and groups is more important than any change as such. And the way I'd translate that is essentially the way we go about change is more important than change itself. Or as Cotter talks about, just the way we do things around here, it just becomes that's what we do. So it's more about how we go about the change rather than about the change itself. So our approach, our methodology, how we connect and engage with people. But it strikes me, even going back to what Lee said to start off with, it strikes me that there's all these different methodologies and we give them names, but they're essentially the same, whether we call it the human factors approach or whether it's, I know for some they see me as a lean person. All these different names that we've created and almost the tribes and industries and to a certain degree, there's a level of marketing in these brands, but they're all broadly the same. And for me, they all start at the people level. They all seek to understand that respect for people, that continuous improvement from the person's perspective. And I think the phrase is we have more in common than what divides us when we really look into those improvement points. We can get a little bit separated by is this approach or is this approach where we're actually there's a lot of similarities. So when we talk about those approaches, the most important characteristic for me is, does it start with the people, and do we understand the lived experience of the people that we are working alongside and working with, and who we are relying on to affect the change that we would like to see. And it's these people's experiences, and those are the people involved in change, and it's the emotions that sit alongside that. How are people feeling? How are they feeling? Think about those guys in Shrewsbury ED. What are the emotions that exist in those people there? What's happening there? These are some great points from Eli Goldratt. Any improvement is a change, but not every change is an improvement. Any change is perceived as a threat to security. There's no threat there, and any threat to security gives rise to an emotional resistance. You can rarely overcome emotional resistance with logic alone. So we can't just give people data and expect them to shift. And then emotional resistance can only be overcome by a stronger emotion. So how do we create that more powerful case for change? And Adam Grant talks about the biggest obstacle to successful change is human resistance. So how do we create that vivid picture, which is more than just data? Data is not enough. We just have to create that emotional response in people. So all the data and diagnostic work we do is helpful, but how does that translate into an emotional response? How do we appeal to the values of the individuals? What's in it for them? How do we improve their world? How do we improve their work? Yes, it's about patient care. Yes, it's about the organizational performance, but for individuals, it's about their work. And how do we shrink that change to make it manageable? How do we chunk it up? David Mockley says, chunk it small, but do it all. How do we make it manageable? And that really feeds into the model that was developed by Thaler and Sunstein in their book Nudge. Brilliant book. I'm sure many of you have read it. Really the precursor to a lot of the behavioral change units and the behavioral science movement. And their model is the elephant rider in the path. And the idea that central to this is the elephant's not going to do something it doesn't want to do. It's too big. It's too strong. The rider can steer and the guide, and we're the rider. But the elephant is the emotional mind of the people that we're working with. That's not going to move unless we find a way to make it easy for that elephant, clear the path, make it easy for that elephant to move down the particular route that we wanted to go down. We as the rider can only help steer it, but we're not going to be able to influence greatly. We have to create that emotional response. And it's about then building those habits that people can buy into and build and work on daily, and those how habits become part of the systems that people work in. James Clear, another great book, Atomic Habits, talk about atomic not in a big bang explosion, but atomic as in really small. Talks about don't focus on the goal, work on the systems, and the systems being those small atomic habits that are consistently applied to achieve the overall goal. What are the things that we do every day? So if I need to lose a few pounds at the moment, so we'd start with, do I focus on losing a few pounds, or do I build a few habits that will help me lose a few pounds, like go for a run regularly? stop eating so much pizza, that kind of thing. We just kind of build those small atomic habits, and goals are good for setting the direction, but systems are best for making the progress. That's what actually gets us to the point where we start to achieve some of our goals. And we think about where do we start in this, and this is the best place to start. Think of those really simple, easy to implement behaviors. These are really key behaviors in people. So we're starting to think about what are the changes, not in terms of process change, but in terms of behavioral change. It may be, think we're asked to do a lot of work on board rounds at the moment. Think about what are the behaviors that we want to see from people in terms of that. We want to influence board rounds, and what are those high impacts. This is the place to start. So when we're thinking about maybe flipping this on its head a little bit, what Adam Grant says here about the biggest obstacle being the successful change to human resistance. Or maybe if we flipped it on its head slightly, then we said, like a slide, the biggest enabler of successful change is also human behavior. It's because, to repeat that point again, it is people that affect change. We can't do anything. We can produce data, we can produce stories, but it is the people that we work with, they're the ones that make the difference. And without people, nothing's going to change. And it's particularly with behavioral change, which Liz is going to touch on in a moment. It's the change in behavior that will make the difference, because if we keep on doing what we've always done, we'll always get what we've always got. So it's about how we change those things, and Liz is going to cover a few models now for us.
Thanks, Nick. My little arrows haven't come up at the bottom, which is fab. So I've just not been able to move on to the slide, but we're going to dip our toes into behavioral science now, and just apply a couple of little tools and think about how we can apply some of that common sense that Nick's been talking there. Sorry, I've got a huge delay again, Nick, so it's not going on full. So why would you want to add behavioural science to your toolkit? And so if we look at the next design on the slide, you'll see that I'm showing my age and also a cultural reference from the 70s. Nick, sorry, can you move my slide on? It won't move. We practiced this about 6 times before we came on. So it was just guaranteed that it was just going to stop working. So those of you that may have been children during the 70s might recognise Dastardly and Muttley here. And obviously his favourite phrase was "do something, Muttley." And I have to admit, that's what it really feels like at the moment. We're all under a lot of pressure, and there's a huge amount of pressure to just do something. And sometimes that can mean that we don't take a breath. We don't always have the time to really get under the surface and ask why. Yes, catch the pigeon, Giles. Indeed, we are all showing some of our backgrounds there. So we're under a lot of pressure in this system as improvers, and we want to make things better for patients. But sometimes we find ourselves thinking, well, why can't they just? We've got the board round guidance. There's loads of things that why can't they just do a board round? So why can't they just? And of course, I would always think, well, as Nick says, people aren't coming to work to do a bad job. There's other things at play here that means that these board rounds are not currently happening. So behavioural science, why add that particular thing to your toolkit? Because as Nick was saying, we've got a broad toolkit to choose from. We've got all different types of improvement methodologies. There's plenty of research into safety, human factors, psychology. Well, where behavioural science comes in is it's about improving the implementation. And Susan Michie is an academic at UCL and has done a lot of work on behavioural change. And those of you that are familiar with it will see that a lot of it's happened in the public health arena. But also you're looking at people changing practice as well. So it's not just about public health, it's also about practices and behaviours in real life. So it is applicable to us. And what it is a scientific study of human behaviour. It's grown from several fields of study and applied frequently, as I said, in public health. There's a big psychology background to this as well. And it's an opportunity for us to consider how we can give our interventions more opportunity to succeed. So the first step that we need to take on a journey of applying a bit of behavioural science is to be absolutely sure what's the behaviour or behaviours you are looking for. So similarly to the model of improvement, where you have to start with what's the problem you're trying to solve, this is, what's the behaviour you're trying to create? Who's going to do what, where, and when? So obviously we mentioned board rounds. I want the nurse to turn up at 9 a.m. next to the board and start the board round. So if we just have a little look at a model now, this is going to help us to understand behaviours that underlie practices, choices, decisions. And I'm going to use a non-NHS example now. So you can see on your screens there that that's not, it's going to be a bit of a mission of mine to get him into every presentation that I do. So you could say that training wise, he might be in pre-contemplation, in the sense that I don't think he knows some of the crazy things that he does that I don't want him to do. And Nick is going to tell you a bit about a model for change later on that might help me with him. But in terms of our diagnostic in the COM-B model, there's various things that make up behaviours: capability, opportunity, and motivation. And I've decided to think about the fact that I need to get back on my bike and get fit. So a bit like Nick and his pizza, my weakness is definitely cake. And so if I applied COM-B to my getting back on a bike, how might I look at it? So thinking about capability, I think, well, I do know how to ride a bike, although to be fair, clipping in and clipping out is a bit interesting. And I've had a few cases where I've stacked it into the bushes, but I do know how to ride a bike. Do I feel I can do this psychologically? Well, I guess I need to think how that's going to fit into my life and the other things that are going on. But can I do it? Yes, I think I can, as long as I don't go on any big roads, because I don't like big roads. What's the opportunity? Have I got what I need? Well, luckily enough, I have got a bike. And also, it probably needs a bit of fettling, but I can use that. And do other people approve of me doing this? Well, I'll just tell Norm, quite honestly, that I'm going to go out on my bike, but I'm sure that he'll approve of me being happier and healthier. Motivation. Now, this is quite an important one. There's quite a number of sections in motivations. Do I feel like I want to do this? Well, I mean, if it's pouring down with rain outside, probably not. But luckily, there are lots of really good rain jackets out there on the market for ladies. And do I believe it's the right thing to do? Well, fundamentally, yes, it is the right thing to do, isn't it? We want to be fit and healthy. We want to set a good example to our colleagues, to our patients, and that kind of thing. And then, do I have the right habits in place? So a bit like Nick was describing, how can I get into a habit? How can I make this a habit for myself to become fitter and get on my bike? So understanding what might be making up my decisions about if I'm going to do a behaviour or not makes us then think about how we might be able to intervene. So there's a little model called the EAST model. And if you're looking to change a behaviour, it's quite useful to think of it as a sort of a compare and contrast. So I don't really want to make it difficult for myself to get on my bike, do I? So I need to inflate the tires. I need to get all of the, bike gear out of the loft and everything. And I need to set myself a schedule. I need to make it attractive. How's it going to be attractive to myself? Well, I'm sure I can eat more cake if I do some bike riding. So that could be attractive. And what about social? I'm going to do it with friends. I can see that other people are doing the behaviour. I can get my Strava out. This is kind of, for me, this is a mixture of attractive and social, but it's attractive to me to get my little prizes back from Strava telling me that that I'm queen of the mountain. I wish. And then in terms of timely, and this is quite important in practice, I think, is it seen as an interruption of what everyone is trying to do? Or is it seen as actually now is the time to do this? Now is a really good time to make a change. So I'm thinking long days, it's sunny. Now's a really good time and I still want to eat cake. So now's a really good time to introduce change. I'll hand back to you, Nick, sorry.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks. I think you touched on there that thing about a lot of this sits in a public health background. I just want to share quickly another model that I use quite a lot now, which is the transtheoretical model of behaviour change. And this one really sits again goes back to public health and probably changing behaviours in terms of smoking cessation or other health conditions. This really does apply. I've tested this out so many times in actual in other environments with people, and what this model tells us is that everybody has to move through these different stages, whatever stage you're at. Again, using the board round model, for example, if you currently don't have a board round or don't do a board round, you may think you do a perfectly good job without one. So we're in pre-contemplative stage. We don't believe there's a need for change. We come along saying you need to do a board round at 9 o'clock, and you need all these people. And on Monday we're going to start doing them. Well, we've jumped straight from number 1 to number 4, straight from pre-contemplative into action. But everybody has to move through these stages of behavior change. So moving through contemplation. So how do we paint the picture? How do we move the elephant into those emotional changes? Moving into contemplation, then get actually preparing for that change, not just from getting a whiteboard put up on the wall, but actually mentally, what are the behaviors that we need to exhibit to be able to move into that change, and then actually making those change, and then moving into maintenance. And what the fundamental thing behind this particular model, is that we all have to move through these phases. Now, some will move quicker than others. Those early innovators, for example, on the distribution curve, they will move through this quite quickly. The others may take some time. Those that we may call laggards, awful term, but we may call them a little bit blockers or whatever. They may be our skeptics that we want to, how do we paint a picture for our skeptics? How do we understand their behaviors? What's their environment? Again, I don't want to go on about that particular one subject, but if you went into Shrewsbury ED right now, I doubt there is very little headspace or emotion to be able to consider behavioural change, because they're just trying to exist in the environment that they exist in. So we have to understand a bit more about what's happening. And this idea of what is really important for people, what are the conditions that exist for people for their own basic needs, whether it's work or whether it's home life. The self-determination theory developed by Ryan and Dietschi talk about these 3 key elements: there's competence, autonomy, and relatedness. And these are so key for individuals' psychological well-being or their feeling of fulfillment, whether in work or at home. And this competence around understanding what they have to do. If you're doing a role that you don't truly understand, you don't feel like you have competence. Do you have autonomy? Do you have freedom to act? Do you have freedom to make decisions? Do you have ownership and agency over your own actions, or do you feel like you're just being told what to do? Biggest level of stress is not feeling like you have control over your situation. And then that relatedness, that connection to others that Liz was talking about, that social element. Social isn't always about going down the pub, but actually that social connection between individuals. That's socio-technical element of being in work, doing a technical job, but also working alongside other people. Is there a connectedness between the people? So these are all these factors that we understand in terms of the workplace. We may only see things from a process perspective or performance perspective, but all these underlying, what's going on in the background, what's going on below the surface. And that really speaks to that sense of psychological safety. Is there psychological safety in that particular workplace? I want you to think about this now in terms of ourselves, turning the mirror on ourselves a little bit, but also the people that we're working with, the environment and the organisations that they exist in. Because the thing about psychological safety is that it's often seen as a thing in itself, but actually psychological safety is or isn't all around us. It's just forms part of what we find ourselves in. Either we feel psychologically safe or we don't. But it's not a thing in itself. It's the actions and the environment around us that influence the levels of psychological safety. But it is only the individual that can determine that. We could state that we are a psychologically safe team, but if us as individuals don't feel that, then it isn't the reality. And that's the same for organisations. We can speak to leaders, we can speak to some individuals, and they say yes, we feel psychologically safe, but others may not. And it's about understanding what's the lived experience for others. And as we talk about psychological safety, rather, it does form part of culture and what we describe as culture. And the fact that it is everywhere, it just surrounds us, it's the same. And this definition by Edgar Schein, he says the only thing of real importance that leaders do is to create and manage culture. If you don't manage culture, it manages you, and you may not be even aware to the extent that this is happening. if we swapped out the word culture there for psychological safety, I think it still reads the same. So as you think more about culture and the culture that we exist in, the culture that the people that we're working with exist in, Shine goes on to state that what is culture? Well, it's a pattern of shared basic assumptions learned by a group as it solved its problems of external adaptation and internal integration, which has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore to be taught to new members as a correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. Again, this is behaviours. I mean, I've simplified that and taken a few bits out. These are the key bits for me. Pattern of shared basic assumptions learned by the group to be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, or feel in a good or bad way. These could be very positive attributes. These could be very positive behaviours. And Amy Edmondson, who first sort of coined the term psychological safety, she talks about it that it's the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes, and the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. Think about the environment that we find ourselves in with colleagues who, when we're working with people in systems and sites, what is the environment like for them, for those people? Do they feel psychologically safe? Or do we recognize something a bit different? Is it psychologically dangerous for these people? Is there a fear of admitting mistakes? Is there a blaming of others? Less likely to share different ideas, like narrowing of perspectives, leading to something called common knowledge effect. Just how we do things around here. This is just what happens. There's nothing we can do about it. There's a very narrow perspective. Or is there genuine psychological safety, where people are comfortable admitting mistakes, where they're happy to learn from failure, everyone's open to sharing their ideas and thoughts, and there's better innovation decision making. We know from a lot of past research around this that you widen the diversity of thought and the diversity of opinions, you're going to get better innovation and decision making. And again, look at, is this something that we see when we're out working with teams? Is this something that we see internally within our own teams? And that really leads on to this matrix, really, where you think about what we're really looking for is this learning zone. That's what we really want to see. When we talk about improvement, we talk about learning. We talk about learning from what we've done before and how we progress that forward. So what we're really looking for is that learning zone. That can only really exist where we have high levels of motivation and accountability. Not accountability as in the big stick version, where we come along and hold people to account with a big stick, but accountability that people understand what's expected of them and people around them. But there's high levels of psychological safety also. What I see and what I find, and very much looking at that, the Channel 4 documentary, what I saw was high levels of motivation because of the environment that they're working in, and accountability because of the environment, but perhaps low levels of psychological safety, and that creates that anxiety zone, that creates that high stress, psychologically unsafe environment. And the key bit about that learning behavior, again, coming back to that behavioral change, that behavior that exists, it's that learning behavior that is fundamental to improvement as a foundation to improvement. Are we always learning? Are the teams that we're working with learning? And these key points from the original research paper from 1999 that Edmondson wrote. Engaging in learning behavior in a team is highly dependent on team psychological safety. The implication of this result is that people's beliefs about how others will respond if they engage in behavior for which the outcome is uncertain affects their willingness to take interpersonal risks. Fast-paced work environments require learning behavior to make sense of what is happening as well as to take action. And importantly, this last bit for me, the need to ask questions, seek help, tolerate mistakes in the face of uncertainty while team members and other colleagues watch is probably more prevalent today than ever before. So this is an environment where we're happy to make mistakes in front of other people. That's a very psychological safe environment. And we work in an environment which is knowledge based. It's not the kind of old industry where it's labor based. We're focused on people's intelligence, it's knowledge, and for knowledge work to flourish, as Edmund says here, the workplace must be one where people feel able to share their knowledge. This means sharing concerns, questions, mistakes, and half-formed ideas. That's again applicable when we're thinking about the people that we work with. Does that exist? Are we working with people who feel able to do that? And what can we do? What's our contribution to creating the environment for them to allow them to do that? Well, we know we're conditioned from an early age to avoid ridicule. I mean, remember those really difficult teenage years where we just would do anything to avoid any kind of ridicule. I look back at photos of me when I was a teenager and think, well, I did a pretty bad job of that, because it was, bad hair. Still got bad hair, but I had even worse hair then. But as we grow up, those that's welded in our minds. We just condition ourselves to avoid any situation where we potentially will be ridiculed or made fun of, and that results in we don't try anything, we don't test anything, we're always at risk of not wanting to fail. But what the research does bring out, the original research that this from Edmondson brings out some really interesting points. And the question that was stated was, does better teamwork in healthcare lead to fewer errors? That was the original research question for the paper for the back in 1999. Was there a correlation between error rates and team effectiveness? Actually, what it showed is statistically significant, but not in the expected direction. An additional question was asked: if you make a mistake, will it be held against you? And this moment, this eureka moment, this amazing moment of the realization was actually better teams probably don't make fewer mistakes, but they're more able to discuss those mistakes. And sometimes there's a role for us to create that environment where, to create better teams, that they're able to discuss the mistakes, if we can create those levels of psychological safety for individuals. And some further research findings from that point onwards is that some higher performing teams had lots of smart people and work how to split the work evenly. Some high performing teams had average people who worked out to take advantage of everybody's strengths, that distributed and diversity in the team. Some had really one strong leader, those people that we probably all recognise, that one strong leader, but with slightly more fluid leadership. But what is seen from the research is that in high performing teams, all people spoke in relative proportion by the end of the day. And if one person dominated, they spoke more often than others, the collective intelligence declined. And again, that reduces levels of psychological safety. So again, think about our work, think about how we operate as a team. So how do we create that psychological safety? And it really does get back to that humble approach that we've talked about so often. But so set the stage, be clear about everyone's perspective is important and needs to be heard. Reframe the role of leader. The leader is not there just to tell people what to do. Invite participation, be humble. What's the situational humility, and encourage curiosity. We can ask questions. We can state things such as, showing humility ourselves. I'm not sure the best way to proceed. What do you think? What concerns do you have? What might we missing? We aren't the experts. What ask those questions. I'm curious how you came to that decision. What's influenced your thinking? What might we do this better? These are all curious, humble questions that lead and develop that psychological safety with the people that we're working with. Other useful phrases: I don't know, we need help. Admitting our own fallibilities as well in front of other people is always very helpful. Those expressions of vulnerability: what can I do to help? What are you up against? What are your concerns? These are all helpful, psychologically safe statements that we can build in. How we express appreciation is really important. How we describe where failure happens, how can we create a situation where that has been done by intelligent design, almost, or intelligent failure? That's through healthy experimentation. That's recognizing that it was created and done intentionally. If failure happens, people feel safe and comfortable with that because we know that was a factor that may exist. But also managing those clear violations of behaviour and performance of people is that people have said they're going to do something. How do we follow up with that and hold people to account in a good way? But what we do know, and if anybody believes fear is a good motivator, probably in the wrong job. But we do know that fear is not a good motivator for people, and physically we just shut down. When we create fear, we just shut down, and that does impair people's thinking. But the good news about psychological safety, and we all like a better measurement, is that it can be measured. And there are these domains and factors that demonstrate is psychological safe. In the workplace, psychologically safe? Do we find ourselves in a psychologically safe environment? Maybe we look at we can look at this when we consider our readiness for a piece of work as part of our discovery, and then we can understand what is the environment that people are working in before we start working. All that getting below the surface of do the process understanding, do the data collection, but how do we get better at understanding what's the lived experience for the people? So we're going to test this out. It wouldn't be a presentation from me if we didn't have a Mentimeter session in here somewhere. So going to do a quick minute. We're going to use those domains in the psychological safety. So you know the drills by now. Get your phones out or whatever you want to do. Log on to Menti using this QR code and and I want you to, this is not, obviously it's all confidential and it's it's all anonymous, but we're going to use those domains just to give a sense of what do you feel, what's your thoughts around where you are in terms of the your team, our team, what the psychological safety in this team. It's important to be honest here, but also using this as a frame when we think about if we are considering people that we're going to go and work with, understanding their perspective, what is the domain, what is the situation they find themselves in, and how psychologically safe are they. So I'm just going to move us on to you'll see here the 7 domains, and you can just move these through from strongly agree to strongly disagree. So we've got so you can start clicking away as much as you want. So whether mistakes are held against you, able to bring up problems and tough issues, feel rejected for being different, are you safe to take risks? Is it difficult to ask for help? No one deliberately undermines my efforts. My unique skills and talents are valued and utilized. So again, this is not necessarily about picking holes in us as a team, but this is about how we may think about these things before we go in and work with people in their own organizations. In all the site work and systems work that we do, it's the people that we're trying to focus on here and understand that they exist in different environments. They exist in an environment where they may not always feel psychologically safe. And what impact does that have on their ability to change their own behaviours and influence the improvements that we would like to see? So I'll give that a few more. So we've got 6 people so far. There's 18 people on the call. So we'll give that a few more seconds, people to think about that. So this is interesting stuff. Yeah, again, this is just a sense of where you feel you're at the moment. Nothing's right or wrong at this stage, but it's more about how we think about this for other people. And this gives you a chance to experiment with something. So 12 people, 13, right, nearly there. Brilliant, thank you. So hopefully that's given you a kind of those 7 domains. There's just bring these slides back up again. There we go. We've got across. So they're available. I'll post there is a link and I'll post it in the chat before we finish. You can go on and do your own, which gives you a fuller report. And then again, we can use gives you a bit more detail. I didn't want to go through the full detail here today because it'd take up too much time, but you can see a bit more detail. It's more about not so much about where we're at, but it's giving you the chance to work through something around psychological safety and how we may consider that more when we do our work with other people. So as we go back to the start, and as I bring this to a close, I'm just going back again to that. Made me think again. I put these slides together and I thought, well, going back to the documentary again and thinking about that environment that people work in and whether the psychological safety for people, what's the environment that people are working in, what are the behaviors, the conditions, what's sitting below the surface. I just want to sort of reflect it. There's a few models that I want to share with you, just which have steeped in research now and what I've picked up more recently, which are really pertinent to this work. And just to give you a bit of context in perhaps why people behave the way they do and why we sometimes see what we see as people who are being difficult or may come across as being uncaring, or why aren't they doing that? Somebody said to me when they watched the documentary, why weren't the people running around, it all felt a bit like lethargic, it all felt a little bit more accepting of what was going on. And so that's where we understand that's not individuals coming to work doing a bad job. They're a product of the environment they exist in. So one of the models that we find is the job demand and resource model, Bakker and Demiriti, and this link between job demand and job resources. So job resources being the work conditions, interpersonal and social relationships within the workplace, how work is organised for people, how they operate, how it's structured, and the level of the task that people are asked to partake in. So those are resources, and how are they matched with the actual demands of the job. What we find is that when there's feeling of low resources but high demand, we're in that burnout zone. So we find the conditions don't exist where you want people in those feeling like high levels of job resources, maybe in a high demand situation as well, and they feel those high levels of engagement. And what I think we possibly see at times is the top left, where people are feeling burnt out, exhausted, unmotivated, and this leads to that sense of people aren't bothered. Why aren't they trying harder? Well, they're in a situation where they just physically can't try harder. This other model links to that. This is the effort reward imbalance model, and Zichrist talks about when we're putting in more effort than we're getting back, a sense of high effort, low reward. That leads to significant psychological well-being damage, because we're finding that we're exerting all our resources, but we're not getting anything back in terms of sense of satisfaction, fulfillment, sometimes compliments, sometimes levels of assurance that we're doing the right thing. When this imbalance exists, you're creating an environment where significant damage on psychological well-being. So in terms of how do we equalize this? And then finally, this brings us on to the last one. This kind of wraps this up. The conservation of resource theory from Hobfoyle, which describes we are naturally inclined to protect our resources as a species. We will, from an evolution perspective, we evolved and survived by conserving our resources, protecting our resources, not exerting too much energy. We will, if we give too much, we have to get some back. So that's that emotional bank account element that we talk about. When we find ourselves in a situation where our resources feel depleted, we go into self-preservation mode. And sometimes we just physically can't see the things that should be done. We can't hear the call bell going off on the ward. We can't see the things in front of us that need to be done. And when people like us come along and we say, it's so obvious, as Liz was talking about, why can't we just? Because sometimes the environment that people exist in and they find themselves in, they are conserving their resources because of the depletion that they feel, whether it's high effort, low reward, or whether it's job resources, job demand imbalance, we find ourselves. But we naturally, as a species, we will go to protecting our resources. So this really all fits. The point I'm trying to get across is there is more to it than what is just on the surface. Particularly from a psychological perspective, there is so much going on behind the facade of the face. Whatever's going on there is a lot more to understand, and maybe we have a role to play there in trying to understand that a bit more, to help us understand the ability for individuals to change, and for those individuals to be part of any kind of improvement work. And from one long-haired beardy to another, he says, if you look after your staff, they'll look after your customers, patients, relatives. It's as simple as that. And I'll leave